Are you tired of feeling like you're in crisis because you keep feeling like the world is against you and it's you against the world? This is Dr. Spencer. Coaches, I'm going to talk to you about why you may feel like you're in crisis all of the time in a state of mind called hypervigilance. And it is caused by trauma in your history because trauma can change your brain, causing you to be stuck in what is called a flight or fight system. And if you know what the flight or fight system is, then you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, I'll explain it really simply. When a tiger chases after you, you're either going to, well, if you're smart, you're going to run, or you may think you can fight it. But there's also two other responses that's not as known as the freeze or fawn. So you got the flight, fight, freeze, or fawn. And the freeze response is like a chameleon, changes colors to blend in with the environment to protect itself from getting eaten by a predator. And then there's the fawn response, which happens a lot with kidnapped children or really narcissistic, abusive type of parents when you look to appease and please the abuser. Now, what that does when you have trauma in your history, and more specifically, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, meaning multiple incidences of trauma, it changes your brain. And let me share with you a story because that's what I have. And that's what I came from. You see, when I was 4 and 5 years old, I was tortured by some weird program with my nursery school teacher and kindergarten teacher on these field trips where they basically tortured us. They electrocuted us, beat us up, and stabbed us with hypodermic needles and suffocated us, waterboarded us, and other points, some other things I don't want to mention. Now, these memories got repressed, and what happened was when I was little, I went to tell my parents, and they didn't believe me. So my whole life, I felt no one understood me and what I went through, and I always felt like I don't belong. So I had a lot of anger issues, used to explode on people, and always was on guard. And I became hyper vigilant. I became very aware of people, their personality, their intentions, their distance from me, because I was always trying to keep myself safe. And that's what the flight, fight, freeze response is it's designed to keep you safe. And we're hardwired to have this protection, this self-preservation system built in within us, because before the modern age, it was a different world. In ancient China, by the time you were 13, you already fought in a couple of wars, and you walked around with a sword on your side. So you can imagine where we came from, and that hunting and gathering, is still hardwired in us. So when we have trauma, it literally changes the brain where you're constantly thinking about the trauma in your subconscious mind. Because the part of the brain that remembers is the visual cortex, and the right side specifically is hyperactive. Through MRI studies, this has been shown. Becomes hyperactive. Same with the left parahippocampus, which is responsible for memory of people and events. And then the amygdala is also enlarged and hyperactive. And the prefrontal cortex, whose job it is to regulate the flight or fight system, the emotions, is shrunk. And the ability of your brain to regulate your emotion gets damaged. That's what happens with CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, where you have multiple incidences of trauma. Usually happens with child abuse, narcissistic parents, alcoholic father who beats their children, for years. A narcissistic mother always putting their children down. Things like that can create CPTSD. Or PTSD is one incidence of trauma, and is most common between basically high school age girls to college age girls due to sexual assault, and also veterans. Now, that one incident, even car accidents, breaking a bone, things like that, can also create PTSD, where you never want to get into a car again, or things like that will cause what's called being triggered. Now, what happens with this hypervigilance is another part of your brain called the reticular activating system, which basically, when you wake up in the morning when the alarm clock goes off, that's the part of the brain that wakes you up, and it makes you really alert. So you have this hyperactive flight or fight system and the reticular activating system always on, always tuned into potential danger. You're always scoping situations out. And that just stresses you out. It's literally the same response as stress. So this basically what's called cortisol, you have stress hormones, gets constantly produced on top of norepinephrine and epinephrine. And that basically drains your glucocorticoid steroidal hormones, which is your estriol, estradiol, aldosterone, progesterone, and testosterone. Those hormones diminish, and then you experience a sense of depression because your energy gets depressed. And also the cortisol inhibits production of thyroxine. I hope I'm not getting too scientific. I am a doctor. That's why I'm saying this, but I want to give it to you straight what happens physiologically and why you experience this sense of hypervigilance and being tired and exhausted all the time, because it slows down your metabolism. So as your metabolism slows down, your adrenaline goes up, your cortisol goes up, you have this sense of tired but wired, and your brain is constantly activated even though your body wants to shut down. And you're always on guard, scoping the horizon, reading people, always being on guard, making sure you never get hurt again. And it's a natural response to danger because you want to protect yourself. The problem is when it gets in the way of your professional life and your personal life, meaning your relationships. Because if you're constantly, on guard, you don't trust people. So you have a difficult time connecting with people and bonding with people, and you're keeping everybody at arm's length. You're never letting anybody in, and then your life becomes really isolating. You isolate yourself to protect yourself, and you never connect with people. You don't experience a loving and the reciprocation of love in relationships because you actually shut down to protect your heart, protect your emotions, so you never have to go through that pain again. And that's what the hypervigilance is. That's what it does to your body and your mind. So it's mentally exhausting. And then when you isolate yourself, you're not talking to anybody, you can't connect with anybody, you feel like nobody understands you, and you go into depression. And that's when the alcohol starts, that's when the drug starts, or that's when suicide happens. It's not a great place to be. And there is hope for you, because I got out of it because I studied psychology. I lived with a Native American medicine woman, and I lived in a yoga ashram and a Zen monastery, and had a chance to really work on personal development and discover what's going on in me. And it wasn't until years later where I learned about cptsd and PTSD and the neurological impact that I really gained a sense of understanding. And looking back, when I lived in the yoga center was when I experienced peace. And that's what I was always really looking for underneath it all. When you're in that hypervigilance and when you're craving connection, but you're protecting yourself by blocking yourself out, you're looking for resolution, which is peace. And you can't find it isolating yourself, not talking to anybody, drinking all the time, smoking pot all the time. And what also happens is because you're hypervigilant, you may get triggered easily. Somebody may say something that triggers you, that invokes that memory of the trauma, and then you act out a defensive kind of way of being. In other words, you rage out. You get really angry and explode on people. And then it negatively affects your relationships, and then you feel ashamed of yourself, ashamed of having that huge emotional outburst over and over and over again, embarrassing yourself, embarrassing the people around you, and turning people off, quite frankly. And then you start to isolate yourself because of these emotions. You see, what happens is the brain can't handle this influx of emotions because there's anger, rage, fear, guilt, and shame. And underneath that, that's just a surface. Underneath that is helplessness, hopelessness, and powerlessness. And that's caused by anguish and basically the feeling that the vulnerability, the despair that there's nothing you can do. Nobody's going to understand you, and you don't know how to get yourself out of this flight, fight, freeze, or fawn because of the feeling of terror. And that feeling of terror can be so paralyzing, so gripping. The rage kicks in to overcome that paralysis. And that's what happens emotionally. And that's how it affects our behavior. So the cycle of rage, of feeling ashamed and guilty, to crying, to this grief, to the fear and terror. The fear and terror is at the root of it all. And working with these emotions is going to liberate you. That's what I discovered through meditation and yoga. You see, yoga is really about learning how to feel comfortable in the uncomfortable. And it's about attaining what's called equanimity, a state of mind where you're balanced, where you're non-reactive. You see, we have something called a reactive mind, and that's the flight, fight, freeze, or fawn. And what we do is we just react to stimulus, where we react to what we see, taste, touch, hear, and smell. Because what we see, taste, touch, hear, and smell is how we get information. And then we interpret that information, and we try to figure out what's happening. Then we create meaning about what's happening. And we compare this meaning to our core values of what we idealize life should be. And when they're not congruent, we experience a discord. Why isn't life protecting us? Why isn't life safe and filled with joy and celebration? Instead, it's dangerous, and we become suspicious of everybody. What are people's intentions? We don't know. They may hurt us. And living like that in this constant state of paranoia just feeds this whole system, this whole stress response in the body, and it compounds. Yoga works directly with the nervous system through breath work, through bending specific stretches, and through mantra work, focusing your thoughts and thinking specific thoughts that calm your mind. It changes the brainwave frequency that creates a sense of inner peace and clarity. Ultimately, that's what yoga is about, creating clarity within the mind. It is not about flexibility like you see in the gym, although those poses are called asanas. It's a part of what's called hatha yoga. That's designed to basically invoke these unconscious feelings, because those feelings are energy. And when you get to go in these different postures, you start to access the subconscious mind, and these emotions come up. And that's what happened for me. And then when you meditate, sitting meditation, you just sit with the feelings. So I went in a Zen monastery, and it didn't really come up until I went to what's called a Vipassana meditation retreat with Goenka over in North Fork, California, back in the year 2000. And you sit for 13 hours a day practicing this Vipassana meditation. It's a Buddhist meditation where you meditate on the sensations in the body. And what I discovered was all these feelings of vulnerability and powerlessness, this complete helplessness, was just a part of a circle in a cycle of emotions. That these feelings are a part of my brain, the reptilian brain, which is even a deeper level than the limbic brain. And these raw primordial feelings, once I was able to give name to them and put a vocabulary to and express it in a constructive manner, it dispelled the intensity of them. And by dispelling the intensity of them, I was able to feel them naturally on a daily basis, because we go through a cycle of emotions. And that's what's beneath the irritation, was a feeling of helplessness and despair, which is a real deep sense of powerlessness and hopelessness. And the thing is the meditation taught me to just focus on my breath. The breath is the anchor. It's the grounding aspect of my being that enabled me to just feel and not create a story about the feeling. By just feeling the feeling and allowing the feeling to be what it is, the feeling dissipated and disappeared and resolved in its own accord. But I had to face those feelings, and that's scary. And it helps to have someone to talk to, someone who is there with you, someone who can navigate these emotions while you feel them so you can clear them out of you. And then you're more grounded, you're more stable, and you have a brighter presence about you. and a more confidence because you're not afraid to feel your own feelings. And that's how you heal this emotional upset. That's how you heal PTSD and cptsd. And the reason why talk therapy doesn't work with cptsd is because of this brain change that creates emotional dysregulation permanently throughout your life. With PTSD, you can regain emotional regulation by working with your belief systems and way of thinking, how you perceive the world and the thoughts that arise in relation, basically your cognition. And you can actually release certain ways of thinking that the thoughts will amplify the bad feelings. And that's how PTSD is treated. And you get a lot of results with that. But with CPTSD, you need an actual practice. A practice to regulate your emotions and the ability to feel this dysregulation and not act out on it. Because when you act out on it, that's what creates discord with the people around you. And we all know what happens when that occurs. You upset a lot of people around you and you embarrass yourself. Nobody likes to hang out with a hothead. Nobody likes to hang out with a person who starts fights all the time, who starts arguments all the time, who goes into fits of rage. It impacts your social life and your professional life, which causes you to lose jobs, to lose friends, to lose custody of your children, to get divorced. It creates hell in your life. And that's what the feeling of constantly being in crisis is. So if you want to know how to get out of that, how to get your life back, get your power back, and put an end to this feeling, this hypervigilance, go ahead and leave a contact below. Let me know if you're interested in getting some real help and not just talk therapy. This is Dr. Spencer Coaches. Go ahead and like, share, and subscribe to this channel. I sure hope that helps. Thank you so much for listening.